So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's talk, Pioneer Girls and Flappers, Women's Work and Community in Early 20th Century Footscray. Public Record Office Victoria is hosting this talk as part of International Women's Day 2022, which was yesterday, and this week is International Women's Week. I'm Natasha Cantwell, Public Programming and Communications Officer at Public Record Office Victoria. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the many lands on which we are meeting today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today we have two speakers, followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions for either of our speakers, put them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you've got any sort of general comments or things that don't need to be answered, put them into the chat. So our first speaker is Katie Wood. Katie is a PhD candidate in history at La Trobe University. Her thesis explores the history of women's work in the metal trades from the 1880s onwards as part of a broader ARC project, Breaking Down Tradition, Women in Male-Dominated Work, 1840 to 2000. She's also a senior archivist at the University of Melbourne Archives. And our second speaker will be Peter Haffenden. Peter is a project manager and former director at Melbourne's Living Museum of the West in the city of Maribyrnong. The museum began its work in the 1980s with a focus on the history of industry in the area and paid special attention to women in industry. During this work and research, the museum developed a unique archive, which has interviews with women working in a number of industries, including the munitions industries. And I'll now hand over to Katie.
Thank you, Natasha. The first thing I'll do is share my screen. Bear with me. Wonderful. Hopefully you can all see that. So I'd like, first of all, to also acknowledge that I'm speaking from stolen Wurundjeri lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to thank Prov for giving me the opportunity to talk about my thesis research. The chance to do so doesn't come along very often, and I hope that you'll find it all as interesting as I do. The Public Records Office collections have been absolutely invaluable to my research, as well as the work of the reference service and all the archivists who work to make their amazing collections accessible to researchers like me. And also, before I begin, I'd also like to thank Peter for joining me in the presentation. And if you haven't been to the Living Museum of the West in Pipemakers Park down by the river, and you're interested in this topic, then you're really missing out, and I'd recommend that you check it out online straight after this session. So it was a fine September morning in 1897, and in the little valley on the banks of the Maribyrnong River near the Flemington Racecourse stood the huts of the Colonial Ammunition Company, where young women had been churning out thousands of cartridges a day for the past 5 years. On this day, 50 young women had been at work for an hour and a half when their quiet seclusion was shattered. Some heard the sound of the cartridge exploding before the roof of the hut known as number 1 filling room was lifted high into the air by a tremendous explosion. The rest of the day was a chaotic mess of fires, debris, and scattered cartridges as firemen and doctors, accompanied by a growing crowd of local residents, as news spread of the disaster. At the heart of it all were the 3 young women who had been filling cartridges in the hut. 19-year-old Alice Macleod, who died instantly because she was working the capping machine that exploded. 19-year-old Lizzie Greenham and 17-year-old Eddie Fitzpatrick were carried to the offices and died there later in the day from the horrific burns that they received. Now, I begin with this horrible incident to highlight just how dangerous the work of these young women was. And also, I think, because the response to the fatalities shows also just how important that female workforce was to their community around Footscray. So Macleod and Fitzpatrick were buried on the same day, and their funeral processions met outside the Royal Hotel in Barclay Street. And from there to the Melbourne General Cemetery, the whole way was lined with people. The procession extended half a mile in length, and the gates to the cemetery were crowded with people. Because of media interest and the coronial inquest that followed, We know something more of these individuals than most who worked at the Colonial Ammunition Company, which I'll call the CAC at the time. The fathers of all three were deceased, as was Alice Macleod's mother. She lived with her grandmother, a brother and 4 sisters, one of whom also worked at the CAC. And if we can take these similarities in the family experience of these women as probably common to the rest of the workforce as a whole, it becomes clear, I think, that their work and their wages were central to family incomes. Beyond their households too, they had an important role to play in the politics and union organisation of the area, in stark contradiction, I think, to the sort of biases and stereotypes of women at the time, making their story, I think, particularly pertinent to tell in relation to the themes of IWD this year. The coronial inquest has helpfully been digitised by the Public Records Office, and all 61 pages are available free of charge online. The Inspector of Explosives, Cecil Hake, had long experience with the CAC management trying to dodge the more onerous regulations of the Explosives Act. In 1890, the company even claimed that it couldn't abide by the Act because the women who worked there refused to wear the woolen serge dresses required. And the Melbourne Punch published what can only be described as a grossly flippant comment on the situation when they said that lovely woman is never more heroic than when she endangers her life to look pretty. One of the key reasons for the explosion that comes through in the inquest files is just how little the women were trained in the functioning of the machines they used. None of the women were trained to maintain the machines, and only rudimentary safety notices were made available and then largely ignored. And this ignorance of the overall process and thus of the best practice safety precautions is a common theme in the history of women's employment in formerly male-dominated occupations. Women were usually introduced into an industry as soon as it was mechanised, because this mechanisation allowed the work to be both sped up and broken down into small, discrete processes, thus requiring less knowledge and training, and therefore the possibility of less pay. And I discovered that this was explicitly stated by the company in my research in the National Archives Melbourne records that are accessed through the Archives Centre reading room. In the 1880s, the colonial governments became concerned about the supply of small arms ammunition, which had previously been shipped from the UK. In 1886, the Victorian government quashed a suggestion by a British ammunition company to use Chinese labour to produce cheap ammunition on the basis that it would be, quote, extremely unpopular. The following year, the New South Wales and Victorian governments began negotiations with the CAC, who had already set up a small arms ammunition factory in New Zealand. The New South Wales government lobbied for a place not in Melbourne, of course, but a rural centre between the capitals. But the Victorian government dismissed this by saying that in the event of a strike, they wouldn't be able to replace the strikers, i.e. to find scabs. And you have to remember that this was the time the Shearers Union had formed just the previous year and had already thousands of members. The CAC was keen to use female labour as they had done in New Zealand, and they said that this was because paying men for the same work would leave them at a financial loss. Footscray and its surrounds seemed to tick all the boxes. It was on a river that allowed safe transport of the ammunition and was close to centres of allied metal trades. Also, since the 1840s, it had become home to many working class families, including, of course, women who sought work in the area. And historian John Lack quotes a newspaper at the time saying that it sent a glow through the ranks of servant girlhood, while it depressed Mrs. Child of the Servants' Registry and panicked local matrons. So Footscray seemed to be the place to find white, female, unorganised labour. The CAC got 2 out of the 3, but almost from the outset, the women set about organising to improve their relatively good but still meagre pay and conditions. And the first recorded indication of this happened just 1 year after work began. In 1892, a deputation of women visited the Minister for Defence in protest at the lack of work because of a dispute with management about the applicability of the Explosives Act and the quality of the product. The Minister replied to the women that they should be happy to become domestic servants instead, because at least then they'll be learning the skills needed once they were married. And one newspaper reported that the reply came, become domestic servants, no fear. We wouldn't be our own mistresses then, nor knock off work at a fixed time. It was also noticed in the reports that women, many of the women were breadwinners for their families, contrary, I think, to a lot of the presumptions of the time, both then and now. In 1895, the local health officer received a complaint about the working conditions of the factory, and in the following year, the Footscray Independent received a letter from a most disgusted employee, as she was called, which described a situation in which the women worked from 7:25 a.m. to 5:15 p.m. with only 2 5-minute breaks and a lunch break. The disgusted employee may have possibly been Charlotte Crew, Alice White or Susan Gallagher, who made up a deputation to the Victorian Trades Hall in December, complaining of heat, poor wages and preferential treatment for some women. It was in that context that the explosion occurred, and perhaps encouraged by the community response, as we saw at the funeral, in December, just 3 months after the explosion, an open-air meeting was held on a vacant lot in Nicholson Street, Footscray. It was presided over by John Robert Davies, who was the local leader of the Knights of Labour. And this was a sort of radical organisation somewhere between a union and a political party that began life in the United States. Things went quiet for a few years, but then in 1903, a reporter for the Independent newspaper wrote, "The sight of a number of young girls and young women playing cricket in the immediate vicinity of the Colonial Ammunition Company's works on Wednesday morning at a time when they are usually busily engaged at work indicated that something out of the ordinary was taking place. Inquiries elicited the information that the lasses had thrown down the implements of trade and were in the midst of a strike against the proposal to reduce the piece work rates for the making and packing of cartridges. Negotiations were entered into during the morning, the management gradually giving way until they reached 1 shilling 2 pence per thousand, which they announced as the maximum they would pay and which the strikers, having concluded their cricket match, decided to accept. So the strike ended, and once more the employees of the company were working harmoniously together. Now, the reporter may have been too hasty in their assumption that harmony had been restored, because the strike instantly became a cause célèbre. By this time, the Political Labour Council, which is a local branch of what would become the Federal Australian Labor Party, had taken over from the Knights of Labour as the main political organisation amongst workers around Footscray. They held a well-attended meeting at the Footscray Mechanics Institute, at which prominent Labor politicians spoke and the women present voted to form a union. But it would take another 11 years for that union to come to fruition. Finally, in 1913, the Ammunition and Cordite Workers Union was affiliated to Trades Hall, and in 1915, it was registered federally. The union secretary was Richard Bell, who was also the president of the Footscray branch of the Political Labour League. A membership register for the CAC Works records 279 women members and quite a few male members as well. In 1918, the Footscray Union merged with the Small Arms Factory Employees and Workers Association to become the Arms, Explosives and Munition Workers Federation of Australia. The Federal Union was dominated by the male union leaders from the Lithgow Small Arms Factory, although it did have at least one female Victorian state president in 1930. The formation of the union might have been spurred by an increasing number of employees at the factory as countries around the globe prepared for war. In World War I, Australia didn't produce large munitions as they did in World War II, and Peter will talk really interesting about the impact that the production of large munitions had. But the Footscray production was central to the Australian war effort. Every 303 cartridge used by the Australian Army in the war was made by the women at CAC. The female workforce reached a peak of 1,000 in 1916 and were given a prominent place in the annual Labor Day parade. In 1915, only 21 women marched in the parade, but the following year, 300 women marched under a banner reading, "Australia defends itself." The report from the Herald newspaper was nothing but effusive. Nothing could exceed the neatness of their appearance, the light swing of their movements as they kept in time to the music of the band at the front, and their strident enthusiasm for empire and for labour made their portion of the procession the showpiece of the day. The Munition Workers Union and the women it represented, I think, really walked a delicate line in the debates around the war and conscription that rocked Australian politics during the war. Despite this seemingly sort of showy patriotism, anti-conscription activist Adela Pankhurst of the famous suffragist family was invited by the women to speak on the question during the factory lunch break at least once. At the peak of the war effort, there was a lot of press interest in the factory and in the women, who were often described as pioneer girls, with the same sort of jovial tone that accompanies reports of women's work that seems to suggest that there's something bemusing about it, reinforcing, I think, the idea that women's work was worth less than men's. A full-page report of a visit to the factory in 1916 read, "They sit, rows upon rows of them, feeding machines fitted with revolving circular discs punched with small cavities. The noise is deafening, but this does not seem to disturb the girls in the least, and occasionally above the din one hears them trying to carry on a friendly conversation. One young girl rolling cylinders as if there were so many cigarettes uses her left hand as deftly as her right. This small person looks very important, manipulating huge revolving rollers, a piece of mechanism to be left in charge of which would cause terror to the average woman. A certain amount of nerve is necessary for women in charge of machines, for by presence of mind in an emergency, they can often avert serious financial loss. As they bent over their machines, one could not help noting how well groomed their heads were." But the sort of sparklingly patronising descriptions, I think, were part of an attitude that saw the women's livelihoods as merely supplementary. And so by July 1917, as the Allies were winning the war and government contracts for small arms ammunitions had begun to dry up, 700 women were laid off in one go. Conveniently, press reports also began to change their tone, as more and more articles described with concern women who had taken liberty in the newfound independence they had won through their backbreaking and dangerous labour in the munition works in the UK and elsewhere. And this was echoed in the Australian press. A mocking piece in the Benalla Standard described the munition girl as a heftier, brawnier person, never wore shoe leather. And the Herald inquired, "The war has given us our flappers as we know them. Can peace return us the schoolgirls as we would have them?" The union organised a protest meeting in which representatives pleaded that the women were often breadwinners, that their families relied on them, and one spoke of the woman who made munitions her trade. The month after the mass sacking, 100 of them met with the Prime Minister, but he walked out on the meeting in an echo of something that would happen 100 years later. The union was isolated as the movement as a whole focused on the demands for jobs for returned servicemen. The plight of hundreds of recently sacked women was largely ignored. Further layoffs occurred in 1918 and the number of women working in the factory fell to 279. As the federal government increased its control over munitions production, the CAC plunged into financial trouble. In 1921, it leased the works to the government. By 1923, there were only 37 women working at the factory. It would take another world war to bring them back. I'll leave it there. Thank you. And pass over to Peter.
And what about the share screen? Share screen. Okay. We're just getting used to this technical thing. Hi, everybody, and a special hi to our colleague in research on women in the munitions industry, Judy Madigan. Judy produced an exhibition titled Forgotten Girls, Living Museum, a couple of years ago on very much of the material that Katie and I are talking about. Now, let me first say how much I have admired and been inspired by Katie Wood's work. She found things about women in World War I that everyone thought was impossible to find. Any of us doing histories of the munitions industries have found it virtually impossible to find much information, but Katie's done it, so that's very impressive. And I want to say something about the value of PROV. Let me also say how much historians like us value PROV in all its aspects. It is an amazing reservoir of data and detail. It's really exciting going through the boxes. The whole issue of civilization investigating itself and reflecting on itself and giving depth to the broader sense of social identity could not happen without our wonderful PROV. Now, Katie's talk, we know the basics. Female labour was brought in during the late 19th and early 20th century because female labour was considerably cheaper than paying men at the time. Maybe a bit more expensive than paying the Chinese, but this hasn't changed. But now they simply shift the factories to where the cheaper labour is, and it looks like the Chinese got the gig after all, for most manufacturing anyway. Now, part of what we're taught, between the lines with this work talks that we're giving, is about bias and what happened to bias in this industry. Katie's talked about World War I, I'm talking about World War II. Katie and I are illustrating developments around the bending of bias through a look at the involvement of women in the munitions industries. In World War I, women were hired in the munitions industries primarily to make bullets, 303 bullets to be precise. This was basically unskilled piecework, repetitive work on machines that simply punched out pre-made parts to be assembled into bullets. And as Katie's pointed out, it was dangerous work. Katie's presentation makes it clear that the women did not simply accept being treated as cheap cogs in an industrial process. They did fight for better conditions within the framework of their monotonous work practice. They did learn to organise themselves, and they saw issues of pay to be linked with economic independence. The difference with overseas is that in Europe and America, where many thousands or more women in World War I were working, was that they were working on more complicated industrial processes. And this is the difference between what happened with World War I in Australia and World War II. During World War I, Australia had a very primitive manufacturing industry. It's primitive again after the last 20 years. Australia was largely regarded as an agrarian country that basically produced and supplied products like wool, wheat, and apples for Britain and other countries. In fact, most of the politicians and other influential figures in Britain did not want Australia to become too industrialised because it suited Britain to have a nice, secure market for its industrialised goods. They didn't want us making our own. The only munitions made in Australia during World War I were bullets and rifles, mostly 303 bullets and Lee Enfield rifles. I don't know who knows what those things are, but that's what they were. All the other equipment you see in the images of Australians with cannons and shells, etc., and during World War I at Gallipoli and other fighting fronts were made in Britain. Australia was totally dependent on Britain for all its munitions hardware at that time. But it was a change in manufacturing in Australia in World War II that changed the roles of women in this country. Issues about women's roles and levels of pay, etc., in the munitions industries during both major wars were not separate from other issues. Those issues were and still are in a mix with a whole lot of other things going on in the world and other influences on economics, politics, and other social movements, like the union activity, for example.
Slides changed.
Sorry?
Slides changed.
The slides changed?
Yeah.
What do you mean the slides changed? How did that happen?
Do you want some
Oh.
slides? Other way.
Sorry, a bit of a technical thing here. One of the big issues of the day around World War I time was about federation and the implications of federation. We were all grown up in a country that was already there, but in World War I, they were still getting used to being a country. Australia was now a sovereign nation, even though it was a member of the British Empire. Being a sovereign nation, Australia needed to be able to defend itself. This was a preoccupation of politics and a whole range of social commentators at the time around federation in 1901 and immediately after. World War I had vividly illustrated how a country so isolated as Australia was vulnerable to a whole range of enemies when the mother country was so far away and could be distracted by its own battles. Then it was all happening in Europe, so they weren't so worried, but it became obvious that if Britain was occupied in Europe and someone came to Australia, well, there wouldn't be anyone there to help. Now, a group of people, and this is another fascinating story, planned and worked for years, partly discreetly, because the British didn't want us to be a manufacturing country, to make Australia capable of producing its own munitions industries and developing its own supply lines. Two main figures in this endeavour were the manager of the explosives factory in Maribyrnong, and he was advisor to the British, Mr. Leighton, and he went there to help Britain with developing explosives. And a fellow called Mr. Jensen, who was a special government envoy, he was actually a very thorough accountant. Mr. Leighton placed chemists and physicists in the British munitions industry during World War I, ostensibly to help the British with extra manpower, but also for Australians to learn how to make cannons and bombs and a whole range of munitions. This fellow had foresight like nobody I'd ever read about. So while the Anzacs were struggling in the muddy cliffs of Gallipoli, a couple of hundred Australian chemists were learning the ropes that would be the foundation of Australia's munitions industry and the production of new types of work in engineering and heavy metal trades that would see women in a whole lot of new, highly skilled jobs in the munitions industry. It was the work that these people did that led to the development of women in World War II. My mother was one of them. The plan, the image in front of you that you can't really read properly, is a plan that's 17 pages long that was written in 1919 that became the basis of Australia's munitions development for World War II. It is amazing. Hardly anyone knows about it, but it is the blueprint for the Australia that we all grew up in. The central idea of the plan was the development of a serious munitions industry in Australia, with the ordnance factory in Maribyrnong specially set up to develop cannons, bombs, planes, trucks, boats, and all kinds of things. At the height of World War II, Australia was producing about 250,000 new products through the munitions industry. It was basically rifles and bullets in World War I, and in World War II, it got to thousands and thousands and thousands. Now, this led to a whole lot of new jobs for women, which will now show you what's happened to this thing. We have a few pictures of the sort of jobs that women were doing in World War II. You'll notice that they're not wearing dresses anymore. In World War I and all those machines, they were often wearing dresses, but now they're more
Other way.
other one. Oh, okay. I can't work these buttons. Okay. This is women giving finishing touches to some naval guns. Look at the way they're seriously looking at that. They know what they're doing. This is the first woman to drive a crane at the ordnance factory. Sounds like a simple thing. You know, plenty of women drive cranes these days, but this was probably, could have been the first person in Australia, but she was the first person in the ordnance factory. The ordnance factory, by the way, grew and grew and grew and was huge. And this is women workers working at a first-class lathe. A lathe is something that turns around and you shape things on it. And this is another one. I think this is part of the promotion. You can see this woman really knows what she's doing, earnest looking. This is women driving trucks. Really, well, women drive trucks all the time, don't they? They didn't then. So this was pretty sort of, I suppose, a bit of a breakthrough. Now we're getting scientific. This woman's actually measuring some quality about a bomb. They're really getting into the science and engineering. This is when we're testing bombs or testing the hardness. Because making a bomb, you don't just mold up a bit of metal and throw some explosives in it. There's a whole lot of logistics and a whole lot of engineering that goes into doing it. It's got a hardness testing. This is an armor-piercing bomb, which means it goes through the armor before it explodes. And all kinds of testing was going on here. And these are assembly of aerial bomb casings. This is a panel at the museum. We're a museum, so, well, I work at a museum, and so we do heritage panels at sea all over the world, really. And this one's in a place called Waterford Green, which is on the site of the old ordnance factory, and it's all about women. You can see the photographs that we were just looking at, and it explains a lot. It's a short version of what we're talking about now. So a good deal of the work was in mechanics and engineering and management. Women were given jobs to do that women had never done before, because the larger scale of the war meant that more men were drawn into the military. So the jobs they left needed to be filled by others. And the women were given responsibilities that they'd never had before. Katie was saying there were 1,000 people in the munitions factory at the height of it. In 1943, there were 33,000 males in the munitions industries, and there are 23,000 females working in the government munitions factories in Australia. It was during the Second World War that women started working with metalwork, metallurgy, engineering, and management positions that were formerly preserved of men. There was some resistance to these social shifts, but the sheer momentum and needs of the war rolled over most objections. All that kind of stuff about what people should and shouldn't be doing just got wiped out by the demands of the war machine. There was one example on a particular project at the Ordnance Factory, the production of that semi-armor piercing bomb. There was a special heat treatment in the engineering of it. Requirements were conducted entirely by women because they were considered better at dealing with this process. It's actually quite interesting. Throughout the whole munitions industry, women were considered to be better at some of those finer tasks. Some of the unions actually pushed for equal pay for women doing equal jobs, not because they were generous, it was because they didn't want women on lower wages undermining their jobs by doing the same thing. Most of the other thing about the munitions jobs is though they got a lot better pay, and there's a whole lot of stories of the social times with women going out and wearing better dresses than everybody else. Now, there's another, excuse me, I'll just have a sip. Another unexpected influence on the raising consciousness of women of their own abilities was the entry of America into the war. Why would this make a difference? This produced a considerable shift in the social values in Australia, which encouraged a more rebellious attitude to the more static conventions of Australian society, previously so dominated by British values. If you're watching any of those English movies on late night television from the 1940s, you'll see a very different world than the one we all grew up in. There are endless articles on the influence. We did not go into it, but I just wanted to bring this up to show that the evolution of any movement or social attitude is not just dependent on one or two factors. It wasn't just the women raising their own consciousness. Other elements come into play in the most unexpected ways for the most unexpected quarters. Here's some men playing with some little plastic things. They're actually models for specifications for American munitions. This is, I think, the pivotal point, and none of you will have seen these pictures. It was when Australian munitions started to make ammunition for the American troops that were stationed here, because it was dangerous bringing it across the Pacific. The Japanese could have intervened, so there was a whole process here. This is quite a remarkable point in time. It was only and here's a woman at munitions factory actually testing these specifications on our manufacturing processes. The technical shift to American influence and engagement was symbolized by the move to make these things. Now, our next picture is we jump from the little plastic things or the specifications to Rosie the Riveter. I suspect that many of you all know about Rosie the Riveter. Rosie's the most vivid expression of this influence comes from the image of the iconic Rosie the Riveter, a character invented to attract American women to the war effort by working in the munitions industry in America. This image was so powerful, it went all over the Allies, England, Australia, Canada and all that, including Australia. This proud image of a tough, resourceful, capable woman cannot be underestimated in the rising consciousness of women's independence. If you Google Rosie the Riveter now, you will be stunned by the amount of retro paraphernalia that still exists around Rosie. Although this was a specific American image, the emphasis of the image of women being tough and resourceful was picked up strongly in Australia. We're familiar with this image, but I think that this image was really striking at the time and has held its I suppose, power. This image of a woman as a tough character was picked up by the Australian artists in the production of Australian promotion of the war effort. As you can see, oh, your picture's in the way. How do I, sorry. There's a woman here who looks like Rosie the Riveter. Oh, God.
It's okay.
I can't work these things. There's a woman here who looks like Rosie the Riveter. Can't see it, I don't think, because our screen. This is a more moderate one at the time, and women are all wearing uniforms and looking very professional and official. This one's practically war goddess. So we're really going over the top here. You know? So these images are all new. We're quite used to this. And then here's a picture of Rosie with in the sort of factory where riveting took place. And here is the woman on the right is part of a team of riveters. So this is our very own Rosie the Riveter at work riveting. I just want to throw in a couple of other things. In England, there was a air transport auxiliary. Women were actually flying planes. I think I've put my pictures in the wrong place. This is called the Spitfire Girls. It was just another. It had never happened before. Well, there were a couple of heroines, but not usually. Then this was wild. We went to a restaurant a couple of weeks ago, a Bali restaurant, and there was Rosie the Riveter being used in a campaign today. Even stranger was this one. There's a Hindu woman in a Rosie the Riveter stance. It's quite remarkable. I'll leave those times. I just want to go about my mother's story. I've still got time, haven't I? Just a few short weeks ago, I heard more about the influence of these war times on my own mother than I had ever heard before. I was telling my partner, Kerry, about this talk I was asked to do, and she told me things my mother had told her many years ago. Things my mother never told her own children. I didn't know about this. Neither did my sister, as far as I know. My own mother told Kerry that she felt a bit guilty, that she shouldn't really talk about how good her friends and her felt and how much fun they had during the war. They were in charge of their work positions because most of the men were off somewhere at war. My father was an Air Force mechanic based in Darwin. My mother was part of a team making tank treads or caterpillar track for the wheels of army tanks. So my mother and her friends socialized together and went out together and were able to do things the way they wanted to do them. There were no men in their groups, and so they became a sort of brotherhood. We might want them to call it a sisterhood, but they saw themselves as a kind of brotherhood, as they were acting out the way that the boys used to hang out. I'd never heard about this before. They were hanging out as a sort of gang, and the interesting bit is that they masculinized their names and changed their nicknames into names with a masculine edge. For example, they changed Stephanie into Steve, Phyllis to Phil, and Bezzy to Baz, or used abbreviations of their last names and so on. This was their way of asserting their equality at the time. They felt free to do what they wanted and also to support each other. They went to the movies together. They went to all-night dances together. They did everything together and had a good time doing that with no one to answer to. My mother told my partner, Kerry, that she never felt as good as she did then during the war, nor at any time before or after that time. No wonder she didn't tell us. For a short time, they had achieved a kind of equality. Now, they were pushed back into the home after the war, but they had tasted a new form of independence and equality, and they were never pushed back to where they had been before. My mother preferred working to being in the home and continued to work in my lifetime. I thought that was normal, and she never talked to cooking. I remember visiting a friend's house where I was about 12, and his mother was wearing a dress in the middle of the day, which at the time I found a bit strange, as I had not seen that before. And I just realized while writing this paper that my own path through life was inspired by mother's constant urge to educate herself and improve herself. My position in life was achieved because of the raised consciousness of equality of women that my mother experienced during those war years. Okay, did I go over time?
That was great, Peter. Thank you.
Oh, good.
You were actually dead on time.
Oh, whoa, what a relief. First time for everyone.
No, actually, you 1 minute under. You've got 1 more minute to talk if you want to.
No, it's okay. Good, it was all clear, I hope.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie and Peter. They're both fascinating talks, and we've got lots of people commenting and saying how much they like them. We've got a question here from Robin Kirby. I don't know if either of you know about the Forgotten Girls exhibition.
Oh, do I know about it?
Yes.
Yes, it was at the
Yes.
museum, so I would
Oh,
hope.
fantastic. Sure, she wants just a bit more information about that exhibition.
Well, there's an exhibition at Women in the Munitions. A lot about, first of all, war, a lot of the stuff that Katie was talking about, and then a bit about the Second World War. There's a document somewhere which I could find. If Natasha, if she sends you her email, I can send her a copy of the thing.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. So everyone will have my email. It should be when you got the invite, it should have my email as on there. So yeah, if you'd like to send me your email, I can get Peter to send you that information. We've got another question here from Sheila. What about the early involvement of women as factory inspectors in Victoria in war-related clothing industry, like Margaret Cuthbertson from her 1894 appointment, and Dr. Ethel Osborne, who had 2 years in the UK in World War I as head supervisor of munitions factories. In World War II, Gwyneth Rivet nee Terry, later a noted educationalist, was for 2 years personal officer at the ordnance factory.
I could start, Peter, if you know. I don't know about World War II because I haven't reached that point yet in my research, but I have looked into women in the metal trades in the 20s, and Dr. Ethel Osborne comes up there in an all-female run inquiry into women in the metal trades in 1927, which I think was the first time there was an all-women inquiry panel. But the female factory inspectors only inspected industries that were overseen by the wages boards, and the clothing industry would have been one of those, because there was the Textile Workers Union that led the famous strike in 1882, and that eventually, that established the wages board to do something about sweating and outsourcing. But because what I've found in my research is that when you have women moving into male-dominated industries, then they, particularly in the metal trades, they tend not to have been unionised, because the male metal unions are hostile to organising them. And so they don't set up wages boards, because it's often the unions that are pushing for wages boards to be set up. So in World War I, at least, they weren't overseen by the women factory inspectors. They were overseen usually by the inspector of explosives. Now, what that said about the safety and pay and so on of the women in the industry is a much bigger question.
I don't know anything about this at all. Natasha, Sheila could send you her email. I can exchange that and get a bit further with what I do know or what notes I have got, but it's not something that's come into my consciousness.
Yes, I mean, anyone, you're also welcome to send me your questions after the talk if you think of something, and I can pass on your questions to Peter and Katie.
Quite happy to answer emails after the show.
We've got quite a few more questions here now. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So if we don't get to your question, then you're also welcome to email it to me. But we've got one here. Deborah wants to know, I'm curious as to what it was that sparked Katie's interest in the ammunitions factory, as she obviously has dug deeply into the history of the subject. What kicked it all off?
Thank you. I like these questions because I get to talk about things that particularly interest me. There's another question above that for Peter too, so give him a go next. But I'm doing my PhD as part of an Australian Research Council project on women in male-dominated industries. It's led by Professor Diane Kirkby and Dr. Emma Robertson. And they let me look at the metal trades as part of my PhD thesis. And the first question I had to answer was, when did women start moving into the metal trade? So I looked at things like production bulletins, which list the number of people employed in each industry by sex and state and all of those kind of things, going back to the 1800s. And I just, like everyone, I'd sort of assumed that women would only be involved in the munitions industry around the First World War or the Second World War. And so it sort of really surprised when I found that there were hundreds of women listed as ammunition workers in the 1890s in Victoria. But then it took me a whole lot more time, probably longer than it should have, because it was my early days of my research. I was just getting the hang of it. To find the Colonial Ammunition Company, and I went from there. I didn't know the Living Museum of the West, and they were running a project along the same lines right at the same time that I was doing my thesis, that research as well, which was the pamphlet by Judy Madigan that Peter mentioned before.
Fantastic. I've got a couple of questions for you, Peter. Linda wants to know what days, hours, shifts the women were working in the munitions industry in World War II. And we've had another question up here somewhere which asked if you can explain a little bit more about the photographs that you showed.
Oh, okay. The shifts were 24 hours. So there was 11 till 3 or 3 till 7, 7 till... They just, in the height of it was around the clock. All so the whole munitions industry, there were 3 shifts, and there were trams taking people to and fro, and it was all dark because they didn't want to get bombed. And what was the second one?
They haven't specified which photographs, but they'd like just some more information about the photographs that you shared.
Their photographs. What do you mean information? You mean
maybe if so the person that asked that question, if you want to put a question in the Q&A specifying if there was a particular photograph you're really interested in, then Peter can talk about that particular photograph. So we've got another question here. There was a munitions factory in Somerville Road, Yarraville, corner of Stephen Street, which closed in the 80s, I think. Do you know if this factory was independent or part of the Colonial Ammunitions Factory?
what year is this?
Oh, it says it closed in the 80s.
There were quite a few explosives factories around the place, as opposed to munitions. I mean, munitions usually means bullets, but explosives factory usually mean nitroglycerine and things like that. So there is actually a bit of a distinction there. So I think there were factories in the, I suppose, Yarraville and Williamstown area that were explosives factories. I don't know too much about them, but I know they were there.
Okay.
But I don't think there were no bullets. There wasn't part of CA, Colonial Ammunition Company. That was specifically on the river, Maribyrnong River in Footscray. That was it.
And it shut down in 1923 too. So.
Yeah, it was bought out by the Commonwealth. In World War I, there were still people believed in privatization, so it was private companies that made weapons. In World War II, they'd gone all sort of socialist, and it was the government that made explosives. Now it's back the other way again. That's quite an interesting wave going back and forward through history in the munitions industries. And our bullets these days, do you think we make our own? No, the French make them. That's neoliberalism for you.
Okay, so Diane's gotten back to us about the photographs. She wants to know the source of the photographs. Who took those photographs?
Well, they all turned up in boxes at the museum from my point of view. Earlier, archaeologist Gary Vines would have sourced a few. When the factories were closed down, we used to go over and actually fossick around it. One of the great museum techniques was to swap a box of beer to take some books away. That was the protocol at the time. Everything we've got has been partly from scavenging and things that were left over, and as well as and prov. That's that, because they just dumped everything. It's quite incredible. Very little was actually kept. In fact, the whole industry's gone.
They look like publicity photos, Peter.
Oh, yes. There were, of course, during the war, they were taking pictures. There were publicity photos, but I don't know where I haven't seen any of the books or magazines that they were in. But you're right. There was actually publicity paintings as well by some woman whose name I've forgotten now. There was a fair bit of that, but I haven't even thought of looking at the promotional side of things. I was just interested in the production, what they produced and the build up to it. And I mean, it took them something like 10 years to learn to make a bomb. They didn't just turn around and make bombs, even though they'd been to England and learned physics and chemistry. It took them and probably 20 years to get around to being able to make decent enough cannons, but it all happened to come together at the beginning of World War II. And Australia couldn't be more different in its ability to make, we don't like wars, of course, so we don't actually study them. It was partly accidental that I came into this sort of study anyway, because where we are in the city of Maribyrnong, the museum, of all the 151 federal electorates in Australia, it's the only electorate that was the nerve centre of the war machine in both World War I and World War II. And so it's not a personal interest. It was what you call fate. I happened to be in that spot when the re-interest with the Gallipoli came around, and I always thought, well, I thought we always look at the running up cliffs business, but the actual manufacture of stuff is far more complex, far more interesting, really, and quite an incredible story. It would make a great movie, but no one's going to bother.
Thanks, Peter. Lisa, I see you've got your hand up, but if you could instead put your comment in the Q&A, that would help. We're not actually going to be answering any raised hands. So Marie has a question here. Given the amount of unemployment at the beginning of World War II, can you talk about the great improvement in social conditions which the employment of women in munitions made in Melbourne?
For me?
I guess this would be, you're our World War II expert here.
I guess so. I don't really know. I mean, I know they got a lot more money than women normally got, and they spent it, but I didn't know there was a whole lot of unemployment at the beginning of World War II. I haven't looked at employment. I haven't looked at the greater context at this point. I have been looking specifically at the munitions industries in the city of Maribyrnong. I haven't actually studied the broader economic outlook and how that fitted in. I think there's a couple of books about that kind of thing, but it's not what I actually focused on. There are more pictures for the person who want to know about pictures, but there's not that many pictures actually around. You could check the War Memorial, but they don't have that many either.
I just want to ask people, there's a lot of things going on in the chat, but if you've specifically got a question, if you could put it in the Q&A, that will help us to find it faster. Someone has asked, was the cordite factory in Raleigh Road part of this? By this, I assume you know what?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then taken over by the government.
Yeah, it was actually a separate, there were three major munitions things. There was the ammunition factory that Katie's been talking about. There was the explosives factory in Maribyrnong, which is the cordite factory, it made cordite to put in bullets so that they'd fire. And the ordnance factory wasn't actually put into place till the 1920s, and it was all about equipment. And they're all government factories but not until the 1920s. The ammunition factory was private enterprise. The explosives factory was a government factory, which is rather odd. And that was started in 1912, I think, to provide cordite, because we all think that gunpowder's in bullets, but they haven't used gunpowder for 100 years because it gave off smoke, and if you were hiding, the smoke came up, you got shot because they could see where you were. Cordite was smokeless, plus it was 6 times stronger than gunpowder, and it's made out of nitroglycerine with a few things to make it a little bit more stable.
And if you chew it, it's meant to give you a little bit of a high.
Let's find some, Katie, and give it a shot.
Some of the press reports were of women chewing it, and to experience that little bit of a high, but then they would get sick. But
Surprise, surprise.
it's similar to the TNT production.
Sorry?
So in the UK, when they were producing TNT, the explosives, that apparently the production process meant that the women who were producing it had these glowing, glowing cheeks and and so on. And so the press reports were always of the women from the TNT factories were the ones that always got married the quickest, and
they probably died the quickest.
Right. Well, I can't imagine what that would actually be.
And turned all their hair blonde as well. It was like peroxide.
Yeah, not actually something you'd be particularly keen to try.
We've got a couple more questions here. Katie, you mentioned an anti-conscription meeting during World War I. Do you know anything about this meeting or the campaign it was part of? Anything in the police files?
I didn't check the police files. That might be a really good, that's a good hint. I should go there, even though I need to leave this chapter behind me. But no, I really do. I only got that from the press, and partly because the Political Labour Council files at the time, the minutes no longer exist, unfortunately. So it was, I think what happened with the Munition Workers Union was that they were on the sort of the patriotic wing of the union movement, which was split, obviously, because of the conscription campaign. The union movement led this campaign against conscription in World War I that led to 2 referendums that were defeated, and they prevented conscription coming in. I get the impression that the munition workers were sort of on the more sort of like pro-war but anti-conscription kind of wing of it, partly because that was their work. I think also because there was pressure on women to be seen as more patriotic and to do their bit for the war effort beyond even just the work that they were doing. So there were always reports of them raising funds and having fundraisers and so on for the war effort as well. And the Knights of Labour, it was I think it was called the Williamstown branch. There's a chapter, an article in the Labour History Journal, which if you want to email me, I can get you a copy of, which goes over the Knights of Labour in Australia. Are really interesting because that from America, I mentioned in my talk that the existing metal unions didn't organise women in the metal trades. And the Knights of Labour were one of the few labour organisations around the world that looked at organising the unorganised, and that included women both in the US and in Australia as well.
Awesome. I think we've got time for one final question. Alice has asked the 3 women who were injured and killed at the beginning of the presentation. Can you tell us anything more about them and how are we remembering them?
I'm not sure that they have been remembered anywhere beyond what myself and the Living Museum of the West has done. Alice Macleod is fascinating. There's someone mentioned that they lived in her street in the chat. Her father was a firefighter who died in the famous George's department store fire that happened in the 1800s. And I think, again, the other 2, their fathers were deceased as well. And I think one of the reasons why women's wages were actually more important than they were ever given credit for is because industrial fatalities were so much greater then, as well as, of course, just illness and so on. So life expectancy was far less. So working class women were more likely to have one or more of their parents deceased, and that sort of made them go into work as well. But there's Yeah, that's pretty much the main thing that I know about all of those three women. They all had siblings as well, I think, that worked in the kind of trades that you saw around Footscray at the time. So in tallow making and what's called the sort of noxious trades, or in the metal industries and so on. Excuse the background noise.
They're like, it's 7:30. It's time to finish.
Yeah.
I want to thank our two speakers, Katie and Peter, for fascinating talks. I'd like to thank everyone that's been listening for your amazing questions. I'm so sorry that we don't have time for anything else, but you are most welcome to email me anything further if you've got questions for either of our speakers. Just send me an email and I'll pass them on. So thank you, everyone, and good night from me.
Good night.
Thank you.